Now that we have it fit, we have to sand the seam inside and out to get it clean. Once the seam is clean, we're ready to add the flux and solder, and then we're going to solder it up. I've placed the ring on the third hand, and I'm going to be ready to place my solder on the seam, on the inside of the seam, so I can heat from underneath and draw the solder through. As you can see, I have the ring hanging from what is called a third hand. That's the tweezers that are sitting on the screen. I have it hanging so that the seam is on the bottom. The seam is right underneath here on the bottom. That's the seam. I'm going to place the solder chip on the inside of the ring so that when I heat from underneath, I will be heating from underneath. When I heat from underneath, solder is always drawn toward the heat. It will pull through the solder seam and solder the ring completely. I have my flux. I will paint it with flux. The flux, remember, keeps the solder seam clean at high temperatures, doesn't allow it to oxidize, so that the solder can flow. If you do not clean it, or if you don't put flux on it, the solder will not flow through the seam. It'll just melt into a ball. All right, let's check this out. All right, I have now placed the solder chip right in there on top of the seam. You can see that piece of solder sitting right on top of that line. That's the ring seam. The liquid is a flux. There's quite a bit of water in this flux, so I'm going to have to heat it very slowly. When you see me heat it, you'll notice that it'll bubble. I'm just boiling or evaporating all the water out of the flux. I've got to allow that to happen slowly so that the solder chip does not fly off the seam. Once the water has boiled out of the flux, evaporated completely out of the flux, I can get the torch a little bit closer, and I'm going to heat back and forth underneath the seam until I see the solder chip melt and then flow out into the seam. Once I've seen that, I'm completely done with the solder. Now the solder is completely melted. Can take this off with copper tongs. It is very, very hot at this point. You can see the silver line pulled all the way through the seam. We know that it is completely finished. You notice when I was heating it that I had to heat it slowly. Then I moved the blue, sort of darker blue area of the torch, the cone, up toward the ring, because that's the hottest part of the ring, so that I could get the solder to flow. And I was just heating it back and forth underneath it. I watched it melt. Once it melted and pulled through the seam, then I cut the torch. I'm now going to quench it in water and pickle it, and it'll be ready for the next step.